When the war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945, the Allies went looking for the men who had run Germany's secret war of codes. Small teams of British and American specialists moved into the wreckage of the Reich under a joint mission whose task was quiet and painstaking. They were to find Germany's cryptographers, seize their records, and reconstruct, cipher by cipher, exactly which Allied secrets the enemy had managed to read across 6 years of war. It mattered enormously because the answers would tell the Allies how safe their own communications had really been and whether men had died because the enemy was listening. Among the most important of the men they found was Dr. Erich Hertenhain, who had been the chief cryptanalyst of the Cipher Bureau of the German Armed Forces High Command. He was one of the finest codebreakers Germany ever produced. Alongside him, questioned in the same careful weeks, were other senior figures of that world, men like Ferdinand Vogel, the chief cryptanalyst of the German Air Force. These were not minor clerks. They were the people who had spent the war trying to prise open the enemy's mail, and they knew, better than anyone alive, what they had succeeded in reading and what had defeated them. They talked, and they had a great deal to talk about because the German record was not one of failure. They described how the German naval code-breaking service, the B-Dienst, had for long stretches read the coded signals of the Royal Navy and the merchant convoys. That was no small boast. In the long battle of the Atlantic, German knowledge of convoy routing helped steer the submarine packs onto the shipping lanes, and ships went down, and men drowned in the freezing water, in part because the enemy had been reading the very messages meant to protect them. The German cryptanalysts detailed American systems they had broken, field ciphers, attaché traffic, diplomatic cables pulled out of the air. They had been very good at their work, better in places than London had ever suspected at the time. And then the interrogators came to the question they most wanted answered: the British high-grade cipher machine, the one the Royal Air Force had built, the one the Army and eventually the whole of the British war machine came to depend on, the one called Typex. Had they ever, at any point, broken into its traffic? The answer was no. They had studied it. They had captured examples of it. They had worked out, in the end, almost exactly how it functioned, and they had never read a single operational message enciphered on it. Questioned separately, in different rooms, having served in rival and jealous German agencies with every professional reason to claim a triumph if one existed, the German cryptanalysts gave the same answer. Vogel in particular maintained emphatically and without hedging that Typex had never been broken. The interrogators wrote it down, and in the 80 years since, no historian has ever overturned it. Stay with that for a moment because it is stranger than it first sounds. This is a country that read the Royal Navy's mail across the widest ocean on Earth. This is a country whose engineers built the first long-range guided rocket and one of the first jet fighters to fly in combat. This is a country whose codebreakers were, man for man, the intellectual equals of anyone at Bletchley Park. And they were beaten completely and permanently by a grey metal box full of spinning wheels that the British had assembled in the 1930s out of a machine the Germans themselves had invented. This is not, in the end, a story about a machine. It is a story about knowledge and about the strange advantage held by a country that has learned to be afraid of the right thing. It is a story about two nations who owned almost identical technology and about why one of them guarded its version and the other simply trusted it. It is a story about the difference between confidence and suspicion and about which of those two habits of mind actually keeps a secret alive. This is the story of Typex, the British cipher machine the Germans could not crack, and of the honest, uncomfortable, and far more interesting reasons why. To understand why gifted German mathematicians could not break the British machine, you first have to understand what those same men believed about machines in general, and about their own machine above all. And to understand that, you have to understand the Enigma. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the German armed forces enciphered the overwhelming majority of their secret radio traffic on the Enigma. It was a rotor cipher device about the size of a portable typewriter that scrambled each letter through a set of rotating wired wheels and a plugboard. The number of possible settings ran to figures with more zeros than the mind can hold. The Germans had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic told them the machine was, for every practical purpose, unbreakable. Even an enemy who captured a machine who held one in his hands and understood every wire inside it would still face a search through so many billions of daily settings that no army of clerks could finish it before the settings changed again at midnight. This belief was not stupidity. That is the point that matters, and it deserves care. German confidence in Enigma was rational. It rested on real mathematics, honestly worked out. Inside the frame of what the Germans thought they knew, the conclusion was sound. A machine cipher of that complexity, properly operated, ought to have been secure. Their picture of the world accounted for every threat they could imagine. It accounted for capture, it accounted for theft, it accounted for a clever enemy with a pencil and a sheet of paper. What it did not account for was an enemy who would build vast machines whose only purpose was to grind through those billions of settings automatically. It did not account for the Polish mathematicians who, from the early 1930s, attacked Enigma not with intuition, but with pure mathematics, and who reconstructed the secret internal wiring of the German rotors without ever being handed one. It did not account for a nation patient enough to industrialize the act of guessing. The German model of the world was complete. It simply had a hole in it shaped exactly like the thing that was about to happen. There was a second layer to that German confidence, and it lived in how their whole intelligence effort was built. Germany did not have one code-breaking service. It had several, and they competed. The army ran its own signals research section. The Air Force ran its own cipher bureau. The Armed Forces High Command ran yet another. The Navy ran the B-Dienst. Each guarded its territory, hoarded its methods, and rarely pooled its best work, because each answered to a different master in a state that ran on rivalry and private empires. It was a structure that could produce brilliant results in isolation and somehow never add them together. Hold that shape in mind, because it decides the whole story later on. And here is the deep irony that sits at the very center of this history. All through the war, the Germans investigated the security of Enigma more than once. Losses would mount. A convoy would be found too easily. An officer somewhere would raise his hand and ask the dangerous question, could the British be reading us? And each time, the inquiry ran its course, and each time it reached the same soothing conclusion. Enigma was secure. The losses must be explained some other way. A spy, a traitor, a direction finder. Bad luck. Anything but the truth. Because the truth meant that the whole foundation of German secret communication had already collapsed beneath them. That reflex, that steady turning away from the worst possibility, is the established order at the start of our story. The Germans lived inside a fortress they believed to be perfect, and a man who believes his own walls are flawless does not spend much effort wondering how to climb someone else's. Why pour scarce mathematicians and scarce machine time into attacking a British cipher device when your own version of that device is provably unbreakable, and the enemy is surely no cleverer than you? If Enigma cannot fall, the reasoning went, then a British machine built on the same principle cannot fall either, and the effort would be wasted. That single assumption, so reasonable on the surface and so catastrophic underneath, is the door through which this whole story walks. Because the British had learned something the Germans had not. The British knew from the inside, from their own daily labour, that a rotor machine of precisely this kind could be broken. They knew it because they were breaking one every single day. Now we cross the channel and we go back a decade and we meet the men who built the box. In the 1920s, Britain had a problem it was embarrassingly slow to solve. Its military and diplomatic secrets were still enciphered largely by hand, with codebooks and paper tables, a method that was slow, laborious, and increasingly unsafe. In 1926, a committee was formed to consider whether Britain should adopt a cipher machine, as other nations were starting to do. The government even bought a few examples of the commercial Enigma, the civilian ancestor of the very machine the Germans would soon carry to war, and then, in the way of committees, almost nothing happened. Years passed, money was spent, reports were written, no machine was chosen. The departments argued over cost and over whose budget would carry it, and the whole effort sank slowly into the comfortable mud of peacetime. Lord Louis Mountbatten, then a fleet wireless officer with the Mediterranean Fleet, urged the Navy to adopt cipher machines and was, for a long time, largely ignored. The committee meant to deliver a machine to the entire British state delivered, for the better part of a decade, next to nothing. It is one of the quieter scandals of the years between the wars, and it very nearly sent Britain into a modern war with a communication system barely improved on the one it had used in the trenches. And this is where our central figure enters. Though he is not a lone eccentric in a garden shed, he is a serving officer with a signals background and a stubborn streak, and he has run out of patience. His name is Wing Commander Oswin George William Gifford Lywood of the Royal Air Force. He had been born in 1895. He joined the army as a young man, transferred during the First World War to the Royal Flying Corps to work with wireless and artillery observation, and carried that expertise into the new Royal Air Force when it was formed. By the middle of the 1930s, he understood, better than almost anyone in uniform, that the next war would be fought over the airwaves and that the side which could send its orders quickly and safely would hold an enormous advantage. He would rise before the war was over to become a senior figure in the Air Force's signals organization, and he retired in the end as an air vice marshal. But in 1934, he was simply an impatient wing commander with a borrowed machine and an idea. Lywood decided, in effect, to stop asking permission. In August of 1934, backed by the Air Force, he borrowed one of those commercial Enigma machines from the government Codebreakers and set out to build something better from it. He would not wait for the Interdepartmental Committee to finish its endless deliberations. The Air Force would fund its own machine, shape it to its own needs, and get it into service on its own timetable. It was an act of institutional impatience, and it changed the war. He gathered a small team at a Royal Air Force establishment at Kidbrooke in the southeast of London. There was a flight lieutenant named Coulson. There was a man named Lemon and another named Smith. It was a tiny group for what they were attempting. They took the commercial Enigma as their starting point and began to modify it, deliberately and cleverly, to close the very weaknesses the design carried. And here is the thing to hold on to. They were shutting weaknesses in a design that the Germans, at that same moment, were adopting almost unchanged for their armed forces. Britain looked at the Enigma and saw a machine to be improved. Germany looked at the Enigma and saw a machine to be trusted. Their central insight concerned the scrambler, the stack of wired wheels that did the actual enciphering. The German military Enigma used 3 rotating wheels and a plug board. Lywood's team added more wheels. Their machine would carry 5 rotors in the stack rather than 3. Of those 5, 3 would rotate and do the primary scrambling, while the 2 on the entry side were set by hand but held still during operation, adding a further fixed layer of complication that an attacker would have to unpick before he even reached the moving parts. It was, in effect, a deeper and more tangled maze than the one the Germans were about to march into with such faith. Then they did something subtler still, and it turned out to be the most important choice in the whole design. On the Enigma, each rotor advanced like the odometer of a car. The right-hand wheel turned 1 step with every letter, and only when it completed a full revolution did it nudge the next wheel along by a single notch. That motion was regular and predictable, and predictability is poison to a cipher, because a code breaker can model it. Lywood's team broke that regularity. The wheels of their machine carried several notches around their rings, some with 5, some with 7, some with 9. As a result, the wheels turned over far more often, and at irregular intervals that were much harder to anticipate. The inner motion of the machine became a messy, unpatterned thing next to the tidy clockwork of the Enigma, and the wheels themselves could be chosen from a larger set and inserted in different orientations, multiplying yet again the arrangements an enemy would have to consider before he even began. There was one more change, practical in origin, that quietly strengthened security. The German Enigma showed its output on a panel of small glowing letters. An operator pressed a key, a lamp lit, and a second man read the letter aloud while a third wrote it down. It was slow, and it invited error, and every error was a possible crack. Lywood's machine did away with all of it. It printed. The team, working with the firm of Creed & Company, added a printing unit that stamped both the plain text and the enciphered text straight onto narrow paper strips, tape about 3/8 of an inch wide. One operator could now run the whole process alone, quickly and cleanly, reading the result off the tape. The faster, quieter, single-handed working meant fewer of the small human slips that had already begun, unknown to the Germans, to sink their own machine. The first prototype was delivered to the Air Ministry on April 30th, 1935. An initial batch of 29 machines followed, built by Creed & Company and delivered to the Royal Air Force in early 1937. They were known at first, almost apologetically, as the Air Force Enigma with the Typex attachment, a nod to exactly where they had come from. Soon the attachment gave the whole machine its name, Typex. A heavier second model followed, the Mark II, carrying twin printers so the operator could see plain and cipher text together. It was demonstrated to the Cipher Machine Committee in June of 1938, and this time the committee, faced with a finished and working machine rather than a proposal on paper, ordered 350 of them. The Mark II became the standard British cipher machine of the Second World War. The spread of the machine across the services was neither smooth nor quick, and here a stubborn myth deserves correcting. It is sometimes said that the Royal Navy turned up its nose at Typex out of inter-service pride clinging to its own systems. The truth is duller and more forgivable. The Navy did order the machine. Its early order was in fact larger than the Army's. But the machines were slow and difficult to build, and production simply could not keep pace with demand, so early naval use was limited to major shore stations and flagships rather than every vessel at sea. It was not the vanity of admirals. There were not yet enough machines to go round. The very complexity that made Typex secure also made it slow to produce, and Britain paid that price throughout the war. It is worth remembering how few of these machines actually existed in the early years, because that scarcity shaped what happened next. Production was slow from the very start, and by the summer of 1940, only a few hundred had been built. There were nowhere near enough to equip every unit, which is precisely why the small number of sets sent to the Army for field trials and carried forward into France ended up so dangerously exposed when the campaign collapsed. The machine that would later blanket the entire British war effort was, at the moment of its first great test, a rare and only half-distributed thing. It was not, it should be said, an elegant object. The Mark II was a heavy thing, well over 100 pounds of steel and wheels and twin printers, and it needed mains power, which meant it lived at prepared signal stations rather than travelling light with the troops. The complexity that guarded it also made it temperamental. The rotors had to be kept clean. The contacts had to be smeared with a thin film of grease to stop them sparking. Technicians who worked on it remembered the plug boards, in particular, as a constant source of trouble. For units that needed something portable, lighter, hand-cranked models were developed, one of them built from more than 700 separate parts, generating its own power as the operator turned the handle and printing onto tape at around 20 words a minute. It was fiddly, it was demanding, and it worked. There was real engineering care buried in the machine as well. Every electrical contact on the rotors was doubled, so that a speck of dirt or a worn point was less likely to drop a letter and corrupt a message. The Mark II could print at up to 300 characters a minute, a startling pace next to the letter-by-letter crawl of the German lamp board. As demand grew, the work was shared beyond creed and company, and the tabulating machine manufacturer Powers Samus was brought in to build the machines in quantity. None of this was glamorous. All of it mattered because a cipher machine that garbled its own messages or failed in the heat and dust of a forward signals post would simply be switched off by the men who depended on it, and a machine switched off protects nothing. In practice, the work had a steady rhythm. At the start of each period, the operator set the wheels and the machine to the secret key laid down for that day and that network. Then the message was typed, letter by letter, and the machine printed 2 tapes at once, one carrying the original words and one carrying the enciphered version. The operator tore off the enciphered tape and passed it to a wireless operator who tapped it out in Morse code across hundreds or thousands of miles. At the far end, the process ran in reverse. The received letters typed back into an identically set machine, the plain text emerging on the tape. Done correctly, it was fast and almost foolproof. Done carelessly with a reused setting or a familiar opening phrase, it could leak in exactly the way the German traffic leaked. Discipline was not a nicety, it was the whole defense. There was one weakness the design could not escape, and it is worth naming because the British had to live around it for the entire war. Like the Enigma, Typex used a reflecting wheel that sent the current back through the rotors a second time. That reflection gave the machine a convenient property. The same setting that enciphered a message would also decipher it, but it came at a cost. It meant that no letter could ever be enciphered as itself. A plain letter always emerged as some other letter. That sounds trivial, yet to a codebreaker, it is a gift because it lets him rule out vast numbers of possibilities and test guesses about the underlying text. The British understood this flaw intimately because it was one of the very things they exploited against the Germans, so they fought it with discipline. They buried addresses and routine openings in the middle of messages rather than at the start. They scattered random letters through the text to break up predictable phrasing. They trained operators to avoid the stock phrases and stereotyped forms that had proved so fatal to the enemy. The machine had a flaw, and the British treated that flaw as a permanent adversary to be managed, because they had watched, across the water, exactly what happened to those who pretended it was not there. Consider what had actually happened here, because it is the heart of the middle of this story. A single service, working outside the stalled official process, had taken the enemy's own future machine, understood its weaknesses better than the enemy ever would, and quietly engineered as many of them away as it could. The extra wheels, the stationary rotors, the irregular stepping, the printed output, the disciplined procedures, each was a targeted correction to a specific flaw. Together they produced a machine materially harder to attack than the Enigma, and one that would be operated in time with far fewer of the errors that were already, in 1937, beginning to betray the Germans without their knowledge. The men and women who would sit at these machines for hours on end, turning wheels and feeding tape and carrying the traffic of an entire war on their shoulders, have mostly vanished from the record. Many were officers of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, operating Typex in stuffy signals rooms across Britain and across every theatre of the war, whose accuracy and steadiness were as much a part of the machine's security as any wheel or wire. A rushed operator, a reused setting, a careless opening, any of these might have handed the enemy the thread that unraveled everything, and it was the people at the keyboards who, day after day, refused to hand it over. If someone in your own family served in signals or in the cipher rooms of the Royal Air Force or the Army in those years, their name is worth remembering, and a comment naming them is one small way the memory stays alive. Theirs was the unglamorous work on which everything else quietly rested. It is hard, now, to picture the sheer volume of what these machines carried. Every order, every situation report, every request for fuel or ammunition or air cover, every warning and acknowledgement that moved between headquarters by wireless had to be turned into cipher and back again, day and night, for years, across a signals network that reached from Britain around the world. A single lapse, one lazy repetition, one predictable phrase left unguarded, could in principle have given a watching enemy the opening that lost a battle. The security of the machine was therefore never an abstraction argued over by specialists. It was carried, quite literally, in the hands and the habits of the people at the keys, and it held because those hands and habits held. But a well-built machine is only half the answer to our question. A machine can be strong and still fall if it is used carelessly, or if the enemy simply decides, with enough resources and enough will, to tear into it. So we arrive at the deeper question, the one the German cryptanalysts could not fully answer even about themselves. Why did the two countries treat their near-identical machines so differently? Why did Britain guard its box while Germany trusted its own? And the answer lies in a single decisive difference in what each country knew. Britain was breaking Enigma. That is the fact that changes everything, and it is worth understanding just how Britain came to be breaking it, because the way it happened taught the British a lesson they never entirely lost. The first breaks did not come from Britain at all. They came from Poland. In the early 1930s, three young Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Sigalski, working for the Polish Cipher Bureau, did what the Germans had believed impossible. They reconstructed the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors through mathematics alone, exploiting a flaw not in the machine itself but in the way the Germans used it. German operators enciphered the short key for each message twice at the very start, as a guard against garbling in transmission. That small habit, meant to add safety, created a hidden pattern in the traffic. Rejewski saw the pattern, turned it into equations, and solved them. The Poles even built early machines of their own to speed the search, and devised sets of perforated sheets that could be laid over one another to find the day's settings. Then, in July of 1939, with war only weeks away, the Poles did something extraordinarily generous. They called in their British and French counterparts, revealed everything they had achieved, and handed over their methods and their machines. The British went home carrying a secret that would shape the entire war. They took that Polish foundation to Bletchley Park, and there men like Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman built on it, creating a far more powerful machine of their own, the bomb, able to tear through the vastly harder plugboard Enigma the German military now used. It is worth grasping just how tall a mountain that was, because it makes the German complacency all the sharper. The military Enigma did not rely on its rotors alone. In front of them sat a plugboard, a panel of sockets across which the operator ran a set of cables, swapping pairs of letters both before and after they passed through the wheels. That one addition pushed the number of possible daily settings into figures beyond imagining. Every day the whole German network changed its settings according to a printed key sheet, so that each dawn the codebreakers were, in effect, handed a brand new machine to solve before dark. By every reasonable measure, the task should have been hopeless. And yet, morning after morning, it fell, because the men turning the keys were human and tired and creatures of habit, and no amount of mathematics could protect them from themselves. And that is the lesson that mattered. Bletchley did not defeat Enigma by brute force alone. It defeated it again and again on the backs of German mistakes. Operators who reused the same settings out of laziness. Operators who chose their message keys by running a finger down 3 neighboring keys so that the choice was guessable. Weather stations that sent the same word in the same place every morning, handing the codebreakers a ready-made crib. Formal messages that opened with the same stock phrases so that a good guess at the text unlocked the rest. Time after time, it was not the mathematics of the machine that failed the Germans, it was the human beings operating it, trusting it, growing careless with it precisely because they had been assured it could not fail. The intelligence that poured from the broken Enigma had its own guarded name. It was called Ultra, and it ranked among the most closely held secrets of the entire war. It shaped the hunt for the submarines in the Atlantic, the battles in the desert, and the planning for the return to the continent. Winston Churchill treated it as a war-winning advantage, and the handful of people cleared to see it understood that the whole priceless stream would vanish the instant the Germans grasped that their machine had failed them. That understanding sharpened every British instinct about secrecy. It hung, unspoken, over every question anyone in London ever thought to ask about the safety of their own machine. The British watched all of this from the inside, every day, for years, and that knowledge settled into the bones of British cryptography in a way it never could in Germany. A British cipher officer who understood how Enigma was coming apart could look at his own Typex machine and feel a cold current of doubt. If the enemy is this careless, he might think, and it is costing them everything, then what exactly are we doing that is just as careless? The awareness that machines fall, and fall mostly through human habit rather than any failure of the arithmetic, became a permanent resident in the British intelligence world. The Germans had evicted that same awareness every time it tried to move in, so the two nations carried opposite instincts into the war. The Germans carried confidence. Their machine was perfect, therefore the enemy's machine was probably perfect too, and not worth the effort of attacking, and in any case the enemy was surely no cleverer than they were. The British carried suspicion. Machines fall, they had learned, so perhaps ours can fall as well, and we had better keep asking how. It would be a lie to pretend Britain acted on that suspicion cleanly or quickly. This is where the honest version becomes far more interesting than the flattering one. For the first years of the war, Britain did not seriously turn its own genius against its own machine at all. The nation that employed hundreds and then thousands of people to break the enemy's ciphers employed almost no one to test its own. Commander Edward Travis, a senior figure at the British code-breaking establishment, had raised concerns about the security of British systems as early as 1940, but warnings did not become effort. At one point in early 1942, the job of examining the security of Britain's own cipher systems rested on a part-time basis, with essentially a single officer, while something like 1,600 people laboured on the other side of the house breaking the ciphers of the enemy. The imbalance is staggering. The house that lived by finding weaknesses in machines had barely glanced at the weaknesses in its own, and a further irony ran through the very origin of the machine. Lywood and the Air Force had, to a real degree, kept the government codebreakers at arm's length while Typex was being developed. There was a distrust there, a sense that the security experts would slow the project or seize control of it, and so the very people who best understood how such a machine could be broken were not fully consulted about how to defend it. Britain held the knowledge and at first did not apply it to itself. The suspicion lived in the culture, but it took years and a genuine fright to force it into action. That fright, when it came, is the turning point of our story, and it is where the threads finally cross. So we move now from the drawing board and the argument to the events themselves as they happened, on the ground and in the field. Go back to the beaches of Dunkirk in the early summer of 1940. The British Expeditionary Force is being driven into the sea, and in the chaos of the evacuation, a number of Typex machines are among the equipment that has to be abandoned. Some 30 had been issued to the army for field trials, and most were left behind in the retreat. Here, the German army had its first and best chance to unlock the whole thing. 3 of those abandoned Typex machines fell into German hands. But the machine, remember, was only half the puzzle. The heart of a rotor cipher lies in the wheels, in their secret internal wiring and in the notch rings that governed their motion, and the wheels were not there. The bulky machines were captured, but their rotors, the small removable cores that held the real secret, had been carried away or destroyed by the retreating British. The Germans found themselves holding the body of the machine without its soul. They had the frame, the keyboard, the printer, and none of the crucial wiring that would let them rebuild the cipher. Had even one set of wheels been left inside those machines, the German army later admitted, the bulk of the early British traffic might have been laid open. It was not. The wheels went home in British pockets or into British fires. The German army's codebreakers did not simply shrug and walk away. This is another place where the flattering myth needs correcting. They tried, and they were formidable. In the cipher research section of the German army, a team of mathematicians studied the captured machines through 1940 and into 1941. By about May of 1941, they had, on paper, worked out how the machine functioned. Their own internal war diary records the conclusions with real precision. They grasped that it worked on the Enigma principle. They understood the entry arrangement and the reflecting wheel. They correctly noted that 2 of the wheels beside the entry point stood still during operation. They had, in short, reverse engineered the logic of the machine from the outside, which was a genuinely impressive feat. They even sketched how an attack might succeed if they could clear the one remaining obstacle. They calculated that, given the internal wirings of the wheels and a short stretch of guessed plain text, the number of trials required was not impossibly large. It could be tackled by hand, they thought, or with a modified Enigma rigged as a testing device. On paper, the German army had most of what it needed to begin breaking Typex. Most, but not the one thing that mattered above all. They did not have the wheel wirings. Without the secret wiring of the rotors, the whole elegant scheme was a lock with no key. And the British, having learned from their own daily war against Enigma exactly how precious those wheels were, guarded their Typex rotors with a discipline the Germans could not overcome. The wheels did not travel carelessly. They were not left on beaches. They were counted, controlled, and protected, because somewhere deep in the British system lay the hard-won understanding that the wheels were the whole game and that a machine without them was only a typewriter. And so, in November of 1941, the German army's codebreakers made the decision that settled the fate of the entire effort. They gave up. Their war diary records the reasoning with a bluntness that is almost painful to read across the decades. It was pointless, they wrote, to work on material enciphered with this machine while the wheel wirings remained unknown. They closed the file. The most capable attempt any German agency ever made against Typex ended not in a breakthrough and not in a defeat in the field, but in a quiet administrative note that the problem was not worth pursuing. The Navy's codebreakers had made a similar run at it and abandoned the effort too, after only a few weeks once they were refused the extra time and staff they asked for. That was the pattern that saved the machine, and it is not the pattern the legend describes. The legend says Typex was unbreakable. The truth is more human and more fragile. Typex survived because the wheels stayed secret, because the German agencies were starved of resources and pulled in a dozen directions, because they were divided into rival bureaus that never shared their sharpest insights, and because beneath it all, they were never quite hungry enough to force a problem they had half-talked themselves out of. They assumed the British machine was as safe as their own, and their own was safe, so surely the effort could wait. It waited forever. The German army's own post-war summary is perhaps the most honest verdict anyone has delivered on the whole affair. Reflecting on why Typex had gone unread through the crucial early years, their account concluded that it was due partly to the care with which the wheels were protected, partly to a German failure to grasp the true scale of the opportunity, but mostly, in 3 plain words, to sheer good fortune. Sheer good fortune. That is the enemy's own assessment, not a boast from the winning side. Even the men who tried hardest to break the machine believed luck had been at least as decisive as anything they did or failed to do. But luck is never the whole of it, and the story carries one more twist that the comfortable version leaves out. Because there was a period in the heat of the Desert War when the British machine may not have held at all. In the summer of 1942, the fortress of Tobruk fell to the German and Italian forces in North Africa, and among the enormous haul of British material captured in that disaster were Typex machines. This time the situation was not the clean failure of Dunkirk. Piecing together fragmentary evidence most carefully in recent years, the historian Dermot Turing, it appears that the German Air Force's own cipher bureau, under its chief cryptanalyst Ferdinand Vogler, was able for a period to read some British Typex traffic in the North African theatre. But notice exactly how, because it matters enormously to the truth of our title. This was not a cryptanalytic break. The Germans did not solve the machine. What seems to have happened is that with captured machines, captured wheels, and captured or reconstructed key settings all falling into their hands together in the confusion of a lost battle, the German Air Force ciphermen were able for a while to set the machines up and read messages the way any legitimate operator would. It was exploitation through capture, not through mathematics. It was the intelligence equivalent of finding the key under the doormat rather than picking the lock. And it was temporary. As the improved versions of Typex spread through the forces, and as settings and captured material were secured, the window closed again. There is a revealing coda to that desert episode, and it surfaced only in the post-war interrogations. One senior German officer, the man who had headed the Army's cipher research section during the crucial middle years of the war, told his questioners that Typex had indeed been read in North Africa. It was the one claim of success anyone on the German side ever made, and then, pressed on the detail, he withdrew it. What had really happened once the fog cleared was the reading by capture we have just seen, the setting up of captured machines with captured keys, not the solving of the cipher itself. The distinction is everything. To read a message because you have seized the sender's machine and his settings is a kind of theft. To read it because you have defeated the mathematics is cryptanalysis. The Germans, for one brief desert interval, managed the former. They never once managed the latter. When the interrogators checked the claim against the men of the other German bureaus, it fell apart, and the verdict returned to what it had always been. Yet even that limited and unglamorous episode was enough to send a tremor through the British system, and here the years of neglected suspicion finally caught fire. In 1943, fragments of alarming information began reaching London. There was a warning passed along by a French intelligence officer. There was a decrypt suggesting a German expert had been sent to examine captured British material at Tobruk. And most vividly, there were the statements of captured German prisoners. An army intelligence officer named Hans-Wolf Haunhorst and a senior radio officer named Werner Possel, taken prisoner and questioned, claimed that a German officer named Wagner possessed a Typex machine and was using it to read the traffic of the British Eighth Army. That claim landed in London like a stone through a window. The unthinkable had been spoken aloud. The British machine, the one everyone had quietly assumed was safe, might be compromised. And now, at last, the nation that had spent the war breaking machines turned its full and formidable attention onto its own. The response, it must be said, was flawed in a way that shows just how human this whole enterprise was. When the British investigated the scare, they behaved at first remarkably like the Germans investigating Enigma. They wanted to be reassured. Much of the official effort went into chasing paperwork, into tracking down the certificates meant to prove the captured Tobruk machines had been properly destroyed, as though a tidy record could make the danger disappear. There was a strong pull to conclude that everything was fine and to file the matter away. Confirmation bias, it turns out, is not a German disease or a British one. It is a human one, and both sides caught it. But this time, the suspicion, however late and however reluctant, did its work. The finest minds at Bletchley Park were finally set to examine their own machine, and what they found was not comfortable. Brigadier John Tiltman ordered a proper, large-scale investigation into Typex security, noting that no truly comprehensive examination had ever been carried out in all the years of the war. Alan Turing himself was consulted, and in July of 1943 he advised on how the machine had to be used and configured to be genuinely secure, confirming that in some forms and with some habits it was more vulnerable than its users had assumed. Gordon Welchman, one of the architects of the British attack on Enigma, put the failure with brutal candour. They had, he admitted, made no serious attempt to use everything they had learned breaking the German machine to strengthen their own, and so the British did what the Germans never did. They fixed it. The machine had already been strengthened late in 1941 with a rewirable reflecting unit, in effect a plug board at the back of the scrambler that added a further layer of secret setting for any attacker to solve. Now the procedures were tightened, the risky habits identified and stamped out, and later models received a more sophisticated plug board at the front that could turn any letter into any other, a refinement that made the underlying mathematics harder still while keeping the machine compatible with everything that had come before. Every weakness Bletchley's own experts could find was hunted down and closed. The suspicion that had taken years to stir, once it finally stirred, acted with real decision. The reforms went deeper than the hardware. The way the daily keys and message settings were signaled had been a soft point, so the indicator systems were overhauled, disguised, and in time re-enciphered so that an eavesdropper could no longer even read the instructions for setting the wheels. Different commands and different theaters were placed on separate key networks so that a total compromise in one corner of the war could not unlock the traffic of another. It was the very philosophy the Germans had never adopted for Enigma, the working assumption that any single part of the system might already be broken and that the rest must be built to survive it. There is a strange and elegant symmetry to it all that Welchman himself came close to naming. The British could reason from the sheer fact that they were reading Enigma so successfully that the Germans almost certainly were not reading Typex. Because if the Germans had been breaking the British machine, they would have learned from the decrypted British material that their own Enigma was compromised, and they would have moved to secure it, and Bletchley's precious flow of intelligence would have dried up overnight. It never dried up. The very continuity of British success against Enigma stood as quiet, standing proof that the enemy was blind to Typex. Each machine became a piece of evidence about the other, and the evidence pointed steadily, reassuringly in Britain's favour. By the end of the war, Typex was everywhere. Something like 12,000 machines had been built. They served the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the wider machinery of the British state and its Commonwealth partners, carrying the secret words of a global war across every continent and ocean. In a final turn, the British and the Americans agreed a way to make Typex work together with the equivalent American Cipher machine, so the two allies could pass their highest-grade traffic to one another through a single combined system, and here the trust ran only one way. That American machine, known as Cigaba, was reckoned by the few who knew both to be the stronger of the two, more intricate still in the way its wheels advanced, and the Americans guarded it with an almost absolute jealousy. It was never captured, never compromised, and never shown even to the British in its full workings. What the two allies built together was a bridge between their systems rather than a shared machine, an arrangement that let a British and an American headquarters exchange their deepest secrets without either side exposing the crown jewels of its own design. That combined system came into naval service late in 1943, and it carried a growing share of Anglo-American traffic through the decisive final years of the war. The British, of all people, were in no position to resent the caution. And there was one last use for Typex, perhaps the most fitting of all. Because the machine was descended from the Enigma and shared its underlying logic, modified Typex machines were put to work at Bletchley Park itself. Once the Codebreakers had recovered the German settings for the day, rooms full of adapted Typex machines were used to run off the decrypted German messages at speed, printing out in plain language the orders and reports the enemy believed perfectly safe. The British machine the Germans could not read spent part of its war printing out the German messages the British could. The child of the Enigma was turned against its parent, tirelessly, tape after tape, in the most secret building in Britain, and long after the guns fell silent, the machine kept serving, carrying British and Commonwealth traffic for years into the post-war world. One nation was still using its Typex machines as late as 1973, nearly 4 decades after Lywood first bent over a borrowed Enigma at Kidbrooke. There is a reason you may never have heard this story, and it is the same reason it took historians so long to tell it properly. The whole business was buried for decades under official secrecy. The breaking of Enigma was not publicly acknowledged for 30 years after the war, and the details of Britain's own machine, the wiring of its wheels, the exact methods of its use stayed locked away longer still. Some of it remains closed even now. For a generation, the men and women who had built and run and protected these systems could not tell their own families what they had done. The triumph was real, and it was total, and it was invisible. Only slowly, as the files opened and the survivors were at last allowed to speak, did the true shape of it come into view. Almost everything we now know about the German side of this story comes from the enemy's own hand. The war diary of the German Army's Cipher section survived the war, and it records their study of the British machine and their decision to abandon it in their own plain words. The interrogation reports of Germany's captured Codebreakers survived as well, and could be cross-checked one against another, bureau against bureau. It is a rare thing in history to be able to prove a negative, to show with confidence that something never happened. In the case of Typex, the proof was written by the very men who tried to break it and failed. So we return to those interrogation rooms in the summer of 1945 and to the question the Allied teams had carried across a ruined continent. Why could the German codebreakers never crack the British machine? We can now give the honest answer, which is richer than the myth and kinder to the truth. It was not because Typex was a miracle of unbreakable mathematics, because it was not. Its own makers had left a flaw in it that went unexamined for years, and captured material in the desert may well have laid some of its traffic bare for a time. It was not because the Germans never tried, because they did try, and their army codebreakers came further on paper than almost anyone realized until the files were opened long after the war. There is no single heroic stroke to point at and frame on a wall. There is instead a harder and more honest truth. The British machine was genuinely better built, with its extra wheels and its irregular stepping and its clean, single-handed working, and the British protected the one part that truly mattered, the wheels, with a discipline that never failed at the decisive moment. But the machine was also shielded by an enemy divided against itself, by German agencies that hoarded their scraps and never assembled the puzzle, by a foe too starved of resources and too certain of his own superiority to force a problem he had already dismissed, and it was shielded, as the Germans themselves confessed, by a great deal of luck. Take away any one of those and the story might have ended differently. Running beneath all of it, though, was the single advantage that owed nothing to luck. The British had looked inside a machine of exactly this kind and watched it come apart in their hands, and they never entirely forgot the lesson, even through the years they were too slow to act on it. They knew in their bones that such machines could be broken, and broken not by sorcery but by carelessness and habit and the fatal comfort of certainty. The Germans, gazing lovingly at their own Enigma, had trained themselves into the opposite belief that a machine like this simply could not fall, and that one conviction spread outward through everything they did until it became a reason not to look, not to try too hard, not to imagine that the enemy across the water might be cleverer, or more frightened, or more careful than themselves. Confidence guarded nothing. Suspicion guarded everything. The country that doubted its own walls came through the war with its secrets intact. The country that trusted its walls completely was red from the first day to the last and never once knew it. Two nations, two machines born of the same parent, and the whole vast difference in their fates came down to which of them was willing to be afraid. The German cryptanalysts understood this more deeply than the officers questioning them because they had spent 6 years living on the wrong side of it. They had broken so much, read so much, achieved so much, and missed the one great thing sitting in plain sight, the very blindness that let the British read their beloved Enigma while they insisted, to the very end, that such a thing was impossible. When they told their interrogators that Typex had never been broken, they were not only reporting a fact about a British device, they were, without quite saying the words, pronouncing the verdict on their own side's deepest and most costly mistake. If stories like this one matter to you, the forgotten machines and the quiet decisions that shaped the outcome of the war far more than most of its famous battles, then consider subscribing, because there are a great many of them still waiting to be told. There are inventors who were dismissed until it was almost too late. There are secrets that held by a single thread, and secrets that broke and changed everything that followed. And there are the ordinary men and women whose careful, unglamorous work at keyboards and drawing boards kept a nation's words safe when it mattered most. Their names have mostly slipped from view. The least we can do, all these years on, is keep telling what they did. The British machine was never broken, not because it could not be, but because a country that had learned the hard way to distrust its own certainties, built better than its enemy ever knew, guarded better than its enemy ever expected, and, when the warning finally came, found the nerve to turn its sharpest minds against itself rather than look away and hope. That willingness, more than any wheel or wire or clever piece of engineering, is the real reason Germany's finest codebreakers walked into their interrogations in 1945 with the same quiet admission ready on all their lips. They had never read it, and now at last we understand exactly why.